Corporations, partnerships, trusts, limited liability companies, and other artificial entities have the right to vote in Delaware elections under some circumstances, a judge said in a novel ruling Tuesday. Judge Craig A. Karsnitz rejected an ACLU challenge to a charter permitting voting in local elections by the entities that own most of the property in the town of Fenwick Island, one of several municipalities in the state with similar provisions. Karsnitz dismissed the lawsuit from Delaware's Superior Court, citing the principle of one person/entity/one vote. Quote, visions of faceless large corporations or even HAL controlling a small town are frightening and the stuff of science fiction. But trusts, partnerships, limited liability companies, and corporations are expressly recognized as persons in the Delaware Code, the judge said. I wonder if this has some sort of connection to like Citizens United, maybe indirectly. You know, I know Citizens United wasn't specifically about a corporation being considered a person, but it in some sort of like fringe way, it kind of was, because it was saying like, because corporations are people, they have the right to engage in political donations in the same sort of way that a person might. So I wonder if this maybe has some sort of connection to that. I think more likely this has to do with a uniqueness of Delaware. I know that lots of corporations like to purposefully judge shop and state shop and get their lawsuits in Delaware, because Delaware famously has like much more corporate friendly judges and legislation. Lawsuits tend to go more in favor of companies and business interests than the everyday people in Delaware, more than any other state. And so I'm sure it has something to do with that, has some sort of connection to that. The dispute over municipal voting in a tiny coastal community represents an unusual flashpoint in the decades-long fight over the free speech rights of corporations and the dark money flooding the American electoral system. The U.S. Supreme Court held in 2010's Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission that political spending counts as constitutionally protected speech. Ever since that ruling effectively ended corporate campaign finance regulation, the prospect of outright voting by business entities has served as fodder for both critics and comedians. Yeah, the one thing I think of just recently is how you see so many like data centers trying to be built in like rural areas, and like there's been a couple of very noteworthy examples recently of like a company comes in, they plan on building a data center at a specific place in this sort of somewhat rural town. The town comes together and votes to like disallow it, say, no, we don't want this to actually be built here. You're not allowed to do it. And then they basically just do it anyways because they find some sort of loophole through city zoning. Or I just think about that, right? And if you give them voting power, and especially if you give them like sort of proportional voting power, and they already bought up a lot of land in these towns, then it seems very reasonable or potentially likely that you wouldn't even have this dynamic where the citizenry comes together, votes against these data centers being built, but then they kind of have to loophole their way in, or maybe are sometimes blocked on occasion, that they're able to just overwrite the vote of the citizenry there because they have enough proportional votage. Delaware, home to more corporations than people, is a fitting place for reality to outpace satire. I had no idea they was that bad. Yeah, that perfectly encapsulates what I was saying earlier about how like the way the courts work, the legislation that they have in Delaware, the laws, the judges, the specific judges that they have there, they are very, very pro-business, and that's why lots of corporations love to get their lawsuits jurisdiction in Delaware if possible. I didn't realize it was that bad, though. Literally home to more corporations than people is crazy. The state constitutional provisions expressly enshrining corporate personhood reflect Delaware's budgetary reliance on the billions in fees it raises annually from the more than 2 million business entities chartered there. Karsnitz, writing in a 19-page opinion Tuesday, rejected an array of constitutional arguments advanced by the ACLU, including the claim that entity voting dilutes the political power of living people. Why would you I wonder what he says to why you would reject it. Because it literally does, right? Because it literally does. I would imagine many of these people who like are like, if there's literally more corporations than people, then necessarily most of the people actually like running these corporations and owning them and benefiting from their existence and rulings that they might have in their favor are not living there in Delaware. So like it would literally dilute the vote. It would literally dilute the political power. I'd be fascinated to see like specific examples of the types of things that they would be allowed to vote in, and how many votes that they would be like allotted. Like, would a whole corporation be giving in each corporation be given one vote? Because if that's the case, then that like would be a humongous problem. Because as they said, Delaware is home to more corporations than people. So then the the power of these sort of like faceless corporations would literally outweigh. It would not only dilute the political power of living people, but it would completely like trounce it. It would completely like overwhelm it. I also worry about the precedent this could set. I mean, if Delaware does get a lot of its income through like the way that these lawsuits are set up and all that kind of stuff, I worry that it might entice other states to adopt similar types of corporate personhood, corporations being allowed to vote type of policies to try and entice these big businesses to move to their state. And like, I guess the way that they would sell it would be so they could have less property taxes or income tax or sales taxes or any of these kind of things on the citizenry. But like, I would imagine that the negatives of this sort of a system, like when it's fleshed out in the way that it sounds like it is, outweigh the benefits of like maybe having a slightly lower income tax or a slightly lower property tax or something. So yeah, I worry the precedent that this would set for other states, maybe a state like Texas, who purposefully has no income tax and a lot of big corporations have been moving their headquarters to, that they would adopt something like this to try and seem even more business friendly. Rather, business friendly in this case being a bit misleading. Really, it's business like biased almost, for lack of a better term. Yeah, I'm fascinated to see some future story where they actually are able to vote and there's some big law that's coming through or some big vote that these corporations are able to throw their weight around and swing it in the way away from the way that the local residents would actually vote. That'll be fascinating to read about. I wonder what kind of thing it would be, because I think it would have to be like Delaware specific, because this obviously only applies to Delaware. This is a Delaware unique story. So I don't know. And I wonder how much the legal like basis for the laws in Delaware right now are connected to the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling of 2010, or 2010. I'm not exactly sure what date it was. I just wonder how much, if there is like a legal reasoning, a legal basis kind of like built at least slightly upon the Citizens United ruling. If Citizens United is somehow, which there's no freaking way it would happen with this current Supreme Court makeup, but like let's imagine somehow maybe there's a court packing scenario, or many years from now there's a more liberal centrist leaning like Supreme Court that they're able to actually overturn Citizens United, or maybe Congress gets their shit together and passes some law that overturns the ruling or whatever. That maybe it would affect how these rules work, how this ruling is in Delaware. I'm interested. This would be a good one to have like a lawyer who specializes in like corporate type stuff to come on and do an interview and ask them about all this kind of stuff. That'd be a good idea. That'd be a good one.